I'm honoured to be here today with Professor Lisa Davis, who is the Special Advisor on Gender-Based Persecution to the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. Let me begin by briefly acknowledging country before I begin. I'm going to do so in the language of the Gadigal people, which is the original custodians of this land. Ninari Nalawanun, Maribudjeri Gadinurada. And that means we meet today at the beautiful land, the beautiful countries and ancestral home of the Gadigal people, the Eora Nation. I'm Rosemary Gray. I'm a senior lecturer here at the law school, and I'm delighted to be here with you all. So my area is international criminal law, which is why I'm so excited to have you here, Professor Davis, or Lisa, I'll call you. Many of you have known the ICC, the International Criminal Court, for many years. Actually, there's some of you in the audience who have worked there. Others in this room will be new to that institution. It's the first permanent international court with jurisdiction to prosecute individual people for war crimes and genocide and aggression and crimes against humanity. And one of those crimes against humanity is the crime of persecution on gender grounds. It's such an important crime for a number of reasons. One is that it's been really historically overlooked, even though people have been targeted for reasons to do with gender and sexual orientation for the whole of armed conflict. Another reason it's so important is because currently the prosecutor of the ICC is starting to prosecute this crime for the very first time. And there are 3 current trials in the International Criminal Court that have charges of gender persecution. One is in relation to a conflict in Mali, where there are gender-based persecution charges to do with the repression of women by Islamist forces. One is in the Abdul Rahman case concerning Darfur, where there are charges of gender-based persecution concerning the selective rounding up and killing and execution of civilian men from a particular ethnic group. And there are similar charges concerning male victims in the Side case from the Central African Republic. Gender-based persecution is also an incredibly important crime for our times because of what is happening currently to women and other marginalised groups in places including Afghanistan, Iran, and many other places where people's rights are being fundamentally deprived. And to some extent, at least with Afghanistan, that's one of the situations we'll talk about today because it's under investigation at the ICC. Enough from me. I just wanted to give a bit of context. So I'm going to start with a question for you, Lisa, which is looking back in history. And that is to say, the crime of gender-based persecution only entered force in the Rome Statute in the year 2002, which is before many of the students in this room were born, and it's taken up until now for the prosecutor, the third ICC prosecutor, Mr. Khan, to appoint his first advisor on gender-based persecution. And only recently has the prosecution, the ICC, started to bring charges for this crime. Hi, Mel, as well, by the way, I just saw you. So can you tell us why it's taken this long for the crime to actually be used?
Sure. Well, first, let me say, Rose, thanks for having me and thanks for inviting me to see Sydney Law School. And my sincerest apologies for being late. Just navigating the taxi system here was a little bit more challenging than I thought. But I'm glad to be here and I'm glad to answer that question. So why did it take so long for us to be able to start putting action behind this crime? Well, we know this is a crime that's been on the books for decades, right? At least since 2002 with the Rome Statute. And it's never been prosecuted. We have a few cases now moving forward that Rose mentioned, but it's never been prosecuted. And before 2002, we never had it explicitly named in a treaty. So why is that, right? It's a great question. And why haven't we held it accountable, especially if we've had it on the books for decades? And I think the reason is because we don't know how gender persecution works. We don't understand it. We don't recognize it when we see it in conflict, and therefore it's never held accountable. And we don't really have language for it. So when we talk about gender persecution, what are we talking about? We're talking about gender-based crimes, right? We're talking about gender-based violence. And that's language we know, right? Sexual and gender-based violence is what the UN says all the time. But what does that mean? When the UN uses it, what are the examples that they give? They give examples of rape and other forms of sexual violence. And that can be gendered, right? Because gender-based violence is about crimes that are committed with the intent to discriminate, right? So we know what that looks like. We know what sexual violence looks like. And fortunately, in the Rome Statute, we've codified different forms of sexual violence, including other forms of sexual violence. But what's gender-based violence beyond sexual violence? What does that look like? That we don't know. And when you ask most people, they can't tell you what it looks like. So that's the problem. And gender-based violence, is that a crime? Is that a crime? Is it? What do you think? Yes or no? Is it? Can you charge someone with gender-based violence? It's not a crime. It's a term of art that refers to a set of crimes that we don't understand. We sort of understand the concept theoretically, but gender-based violence is state of theory for that reason. Gender persecution is that charge. It's that only charge that can holistically address it. So we have to understand it because it's our only holistic charge to put action to gender-based violence. And of course, it's never been successfully prosecuted. So why can't we say it? What does it look like? I want you to think back in history, and I want you to think in modern international criminal law. Let's not go too far. And I want you to think of what would you think is the most famous case of gender-based violence that could be called gender persecution? Of course, we didn't always have that as a charge. But what's the most famous case that you can think of in a conflict? There's one that I think is the most famous, and I think you'll agree. And I think if I say it, you'll totally know it. You'll recognize it right away, right? Anybody know what I'm talking about? Shout it out if you know what I'm talking about. What's that? Yugoslavia? Great example. That definitely had gender-based violence. Can you think of one even more famous? What about the persecution of homosexuals during World War II? Would you call that gender persecution? Just knowing that it's about discrimination based on gender. Wouldn't we say that is? Now you see it, right? Now you see it, and you're never going to forget it. And you're starting to see what gender persecution is. And it's not just LGBTIQ people, it's also women. It's also gender nonconforming persons, right? It's everyone under the LGBTIQ plus spectrum. But when we look at World War II, what are the cases we see that might be gender persecution? We see persecution of homosexuals, right? Well, what about lesbians, trans people? What about everybody else? Were they persecuted in World War II? What about women? Were they persecuted in World War II? I would argue yes, of course. And if you do some digging, in fact, I have a section of this in an article I wrote where I did some digging into some historians were looking at this. You see persecution of trans people and women and lesbians. They got a black triangle because it was sort of a catch-all for we don't know what to do with you. But we don't see those cases. We don't see it in the numbers, the sheer numbers we see of the persecution of homosexuals. Why? Why don't we see those numbers? Because of the double and triple forms of discrimination that lesbians face because they're women and they're queer, that trans people face, that kept them oppressed because they were already oppressed before the Nazis took over, right? They were already oppressed. Women couldn't vote. They couldn't pass on their names. They couldn't inherit the same way. They didn't have the same rights. So the Nazis didn't see them as a threat. So they didn't have an explicit crime criminalizing lesbianism. They also thought that, lesbians could still be good breeders for the Aryan race, right? These are the kinds of things they thought. That's also discrimination and persecution. So we don't see the same kind of numbers, but we still see the same kind of oppression and the same kind of tactics that are used to enact gender persecution. So we not only have to look for gender-based crimes with discrimination behind it, we also have to look at how these crimes intersect with multiple forms of oppression. And that's just within gender. Now take a step back and start looking at it at the intersections of race and ethnicity, right? So we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do to be able to unpack gender persecution and conflict.
Thank you. And those examples take us at least back to the 1930s or 1990s, if you're talking about Bosnia. Yet it wasn't until 1998 that states agreed to make persecution on the basis of gender a crime against humanity in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So previous international criminal tribunals, going back to the Nuremberg Tribunal, had recognized persecution as a crime against humanity, but only on political or religious or racial grounds. So law reform doesn't fall from the sky. Someone has to make it happen. Who made it happen for gender persecution to be a crime in the Rome Statute? And what were the dynamics? What support and what pushback did they receive?
Well, there was a great coalition of activists, our feminist foremothers, fighting in the 1990s. And they were really working in the trenches coming out of the conflicts of Rwanda and Yugoslavia. And they saw the mass amounts of rapes happening. And they saw the dismissal of those rapes as, you know, boys will be boys. It's a problem of war. It always happens. It's a consequence. You can't really do anything about it. I mean, it's a shame, but really, what are you going to do? There's always rape and war. That was the attitude they were fighting. And they were fighting that just as the Rome Statute was being debated. And they were able to get those different codifications of sexual violence in the Rome Statute, which was good work that they did. But they also wanted to put a bookmark on crimes against women that went beyond sexual violence, and they wanted to include LGBT people. And they did that by lobbying to have the word gender added to the categories, to the 7 categories of persecution. And in the first draft, it was sex. And they fought to have that change to gender. But because they fought to have that change to gender, and there was such pushback and such little understanding about how sex and gender work, right? That the opposition that was coined at the time, the Unholy Alliance, it's the Vatican working with the Organization of Islamic Countries. So they were the opposition to having gender included in the treaty. They were so afraid of expanding rights for women and including rights for LGBT people that they wanted a definition. And there was this compromise that came up with that definition. We call it constructive ambiguity, where it says gender is the 2 sexes, male and female, in case you didn't know what they were, within the context of society, right? The 2 sexes, male and female, within the context of society. And it's just been this puzzling definition for decades. In fact, it's never been recopied because it's kind of a useless definition. It's an ambiguous definition. But it was this placeholder, those language within the context of society. Basically, what the drafters were saying is, this is how we understand what sex or gender means. It's a social construct, right? It is. How we dress, how we perform, where we work, how we act, what color our hair is, how long it is, what clothes we wear. That's all a construct, right? That's not biology. We decided that as like societal beings, social beings, right? So that's what they were saying within the context of society. But because it was just so mercurial in the way that it had developed, and because it was so bizarre, it kind of just got left on the side, right? And what's our job? Well, we have to dust off the law books, and we have to look at this definition, and we have to do something about it and give meaning to it so that we can finally start to hold gender persecution crimes accountable.
Thank you, Lisa. And I was reflecting on the fact that we are sitting here at a university where people of all genders and sexes can receive an education. And meanwhile, in many parts of the world, but I'm thinking of Afghanistan, the Taliban has escalated its assault on women's rights to include, amongst other things, bans from attending university. When this recent news broke from Afghanistan about the Taliban stopping women from attending schools and universities, I saw a quote from Judge Chili Ebewasuji, who used to be the president of the International Criminal Court. And His Honour asked in his tweet, "If this is done to a racial group in any country, we will be asking questions about persecution as a crime against humanity. What do we call it when it happens to half the population on grounds of their gender?" So what do we call what's happening in Afghanistan, and what can you update us on what the ICC is doing there in relation to the treatment of women?
Yeah, I mean, we have ethnic wars and religious wars, right? We know what those look like. Isn't it possible that we have a gender war? I mean, isn't it possible that that could be the umbrella defining factor of a war? And when you look at Afghanistan, it really does seem like it fits that mold in terms of the regulations, the oppression, the ideology of the Taliban, and what they have done to implement that in Afghanistan. And I would certainly say that I think that many of the crimes that they have committed may amount to gender persecution. Now, the court's just in its beginning stages. It just got permission from the judges to be able to start looking into these cases. And they are starting to dig in. And I'm certainly working with that team because I think it's important that we are looking at these crimes, especially in that context. But I think it's also an opportunity to look at crimes in a creative way that we might not be looking at, in terms of how gender persecution works and how it becomes invisible. So what do I mean by that? Well, so we know some of the gender persecution that happens. It's pretty easy to spot in Afghanistan, right? It's the oppression of women's freedom of movement. It's the oppression based on clothes. It's the where you work, what you do, whether you can leave your house or not, whether you can go to school, whether you can have a job. And then all of these things enforced with violence and torture and other abuses. Those are pretty easy to see. I would say all of that are great examples of gender persecution, right? Well, what about a bombing of a school? Could that be gender persecution? Because this is the kinds of questions now that we have to ask ourselves when it's not so direct that we can see it. So could a bombing of a school be gender persecution? What do you think? Maybe? I mean, come on, we're lawyers. Give us the right facts. It's always gender persecution, right? You can always make a case if you try. So let me give you some facts and see if we can't build it towards gender persecution. What if there's a bombing of a school? It's a co-ed school, girls and boys, and there are just many victims. Girls die, boys die, the father walking his daughter to school, the principal, the custodian, they all die in this bombing. And an investigator goes in and says, well, I see this bombing, I see the victims, they're men, they're women, they're everybody. I don't see gender persecution. I see murder for sure. I see a bombing, that's a war crime for sure, but I don't see gender persecution. What is that investigator missing? What does that investigator not ask themselves yet? Yes, that is the $1 million question. Why? We get the who, what, when, where, how. That's how we build cases as prosecutors. But we never ask the why. Why did they bomb that school? Not if they intended to bomb the school. We have to get that already. Why? Why did they do it? And if we take a step back and say, well, they were trying to enforce a policy for girls not to go to school, then I would say all of those people in that bombing are victims of gender persecution. It doesn't matter if they're not girls, because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, according to that person who bombed the school. That person who bombed the school, that group who bombed the school, wanted to punish whoever was allowing those girls to go to school. They bombed it because they have a prohibition and they were enforcing that prohibition. All of those victims are victims of gender persecution. Girls and the allies and the sympathizers and the people who just needed a job because they were supporting that system. They were supporters of a girls' school for whatever reason they had, and they become victims of gender persecution. Then we can start to see it. Why is this question so important? Because you have to get to the why if you want to get true redress for conflict. It is not enough to just lock up bad guys or to have any kind of a process, even a restorative justice process. It's not enough to have accountability. If you don't ask why something happened, you are not getting the full story. You are only getting half the story. You are only getting half the victims. And how are we going to build sustainable peace if we don't understand why a conflict happened to begin with? How are we going to give victims redress if we don't acknowledge them as victims for what happened to them and why it happened to them? Because that's how we heal. That's how we rebuild. And that's how we change laws to make sure we're rooting out pre-existing discrimination that's often exacerbated in conflict. So we have to ask this question, why? And that's what the charge of persecution does. It asks that question.
I want to leap from Afghanistan to The Hague, where the International Criminal Court is seated. So in 2021, current ICC prosecutor Karim Khan made history by being the first ICC prosecutor to appoint a special advisor on the crime of gender-based persecution. And that's yourself, Professor Davis. And so in that role, you have created a policy paper for the prosecutor's office on gender-based persecution, which you launched last year. So congratulations on that achievement and on that really consultative process that led to it. I wanted to ask you about the policy. Can you tell us what was the need for the policy and what purpose do you hope that it will serve?
Well, the policy it was the first task I was given by the prosecutor when I was appointed. Karim said that he wanted a policy on this crime. He wanted redress for these crimes. He recognized that there had never been a single successful prosecution. We had started some work charging it in Hassan, our first successful charge, but there was still so much work to do within the court and within conflict. And a policy paper seemed like the best way to be able to get this done. So taking a step back and looking at how the court has done policy papers, usually they're kind of done in a silo. I mean, it's a court, right? It's a prosecutor's office. They write them. Sometimes they post them for comments, but not much changes because let's be honest, once you have a draft and you've deliberated over it, you're not going to be so warm and friendly to a bunch of redlining from strangers, when you've thought about every word meticulously and you're thinking about the defense and how they'll use it, and you're thinking about how it's going to be open and used for victims. You've just really thought it through. So you're really looking at that point for more technical feedback than you are for bigger feedback. And so in that way, we don't get community voices into policy papers. I mean, and that's true for resolutions, treaties, most things that are drafted and then posted for comments, right? And I thought, well, this is really an important paper. It needs to be heard and have the voices and reflected by communities on the ground who are in the trenches on this issue. So before even writing it, we opened up a call for submissions and opened it for a few months so that groups in civil society would have a chance to weigh in to say, what do you think should be included in this policy paper? And I'm happy to say it got the most submissions out of any policy paper at the court, over 500, representing over 500 NGOs, academics, human rights defenders, grassroots groups from over 100 plus countries or territories. There were UN agencies, rapporteurs, governments that all submitted comments. And I would say over 97% of those comments are reflected in the policy paper that we have. And they were incredibly helpful because it helped you to think through things that you might not have been thinking of from an on-the-ground perspective. So after those comments came in, we then held a workshop with experts that Rose and others came to The Hague to meet, to talk about those civil society comments, to talk about the legal aspects of how we could legally uphold some of the things that they were calling for. And that became the foundation for writing the paper over the summer, which then got produced and released at the ASP. And then we had a policy paper. And so now we have a policy paper, and that's great. It walks through the 6 elements. It says, this is how you charge persecution. This is what it looks like. It talks about LGBTIQ plus rights. I think for the first time in any document that I've seen at the court, it's radical for its time, and especially for the international criminal law field. But of course, the fear is it's going to sit on a shelf. It's going to collect dust, much like the charge of gender persecution. And we're going to have this blip in time, and then it's going to fade away. And we can't let that happen. So we have to breathe life into this policy paper. We have to get the word out. We have to help people see what they can't see in conflict. And we have to figure out ways to reach victims, because it's really hard to reach lesbians and trans people in conflict. Sometimes you can get to gay men because they have a little bit more mobility, right? In some countries where the oppressions might be where women can't leave without a male escort, they can't have a phone, they can't have a bank account, they can't leave, they can't move. It's going to be harder to find victims at that double or triple forms of discrimination. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of reaching victims, of getting the word out, and of doing this analysis in every conflict, because I believe that probably almost every conflict is going to have crimes that may amount to gender persecution. And that story needs to be told so that we are also giving voices to those victims as well.
I would agree with you that pretty much every conflict that we're seeing now and that most we have seen in history have elements of gender persecution. So you've given us some examples from Nazi Germany, and we've spoken about the current crisis in Afghanistan. Looking around the world, what other examples would you like to give today so that people can understand in concrete terms what gender persecution looks like on the ground? For example, you've written a lot about ISIL. You've written a lot about Colombia. there are the cases currently at the ICC. Do you feel like choosing one or two examples to illustrate how this plays out?
Sure. Well, I think Colombia is doing some pretty great work on gender persecution, and we're working closely with them. So the HEP, which is their transitional justice process, is bringing the first charges based on LGBTIQ crimes in history. So they've got a lot of work cut out for them. They've been looking at this issue. Something that's particular to their conflict is also the issue of racial discrimination against Afro-Colombian and indigenous groups. So within those groups, how are we going to capture gender persecution? So that's something that tribunal has been looking at and kind of grappling with and trying to unpack, because when you're starting to look at the crimes that are happening in Colombia, we are starting to see the rapes and the sexual violence. We're seeing some with LGBT, but we're not seeing a lot based on race or ethnicity. And that's where we need to also have a focus. Because remember, when you get to those multiple forms of oppression, it becomes harder and harder to understand and identify those crimes. And when you look at crimes committed against Black women or indigenous women, you start to see these racist and misogynist stereotypes that have just persisted for decades since colonialism and slavery. And those are the types of stereotypes that we need to identify and break down and name so that we can start to unroot the racism and misogyny that always exists in every society, including in Colombia society, that was exacerbated by perpetrators in the conflict. And if we can do that, we can start naming crimes that happen against a woman, not just because she was a woman, but also because she was Black or also because she was indigenous. We could start to unearth racism in the society at large. We could start re-examining laws and policies and looking at the treatment of Afro-Colombian and indigenous people in Colombia so that we can start to change the way that laws operate and gain greater equality, because that's what you can do when you're working in post-conflict context. Conflict creates crisis, but it also creates an opportunity to revamp what we need to change. So that's one example I would encourage you all to look at if this is a topic of interest to you.
I think it is a topic of interest to everyone who's self-selected to be in the room, and probably even more so after your remarks today. Are you happy to take a couple of questions?
Yes.
Wonderful. Let's open it up to the floor. Kate, do you want to, I'm going to bring the mic, or do you want to pop up here so that you can be on the camera and the mic? Thanks, Ashley, as well, if we have any other roving mics. Wonderful.
Hi, thanks so much, Professor Davis, for being here. Real honor to be in the room with you. My question is, with the 3 trials currently at the ICC, I think Al Hassan has just finished, of those 3 cases, what excites you and what makes you feel nervous in relation to the charge of gender persecution?
Well, I don't know how much I can comment on live cases, but I can say that I think one thing that's exciting about the Hassan case is that it has evidence of kind of a multi-layered gender discrimination in terms of dress codes, and it does a great job highlighting and mentioning discrimination at the intersection of race, talking about more extreme punishments to women of darker skin, talking about oppression of men, but also looking at oppression of women and looking at the different ways punishment was used to enforce dress codes and other regulations on the population based on gender. So I think there's a lot of richness there that we're going to be able to draw from. And I think that with other cases that are moving through the court, it's a little early to tell. We're kind of in the very beginning stages. But my hope is that we'll be able to develop the kinds of post materials and documents to implement the policy paper that will help us keep grabbing a broad sweep of victims and to be able to a broad lens in terms of analyzing these crimes.
So who has the next question from the floor? Thank you, Rachel.
Hello, thank you, Professor Davis, for being here. I just wondered whether you had any thoughts about reparative justice in this context, because you were highlighting the gender persecution crimes often come off the back of pre-existing persecution that maybe didn't reach maybe the gravity threshold of an international crime. So what does that mean when it comes to redress for victims and how we address the messiness that potentially we're talking about persecution that predates the crime and that may well continue after the crimes have ceased?
I mean, I think that's a great question. You know, what do we do for victims of crimes that don't fall under the jurisdiction of the court or any court? And I think, you know, in those situations, it's really important to continue truth-telling ways to memorialize what has happened. I mean, whether you have accountability through a traditional system like the court or not, there's so many different accountability types of mechanisms that we could use. There's restorative justice, there's truth and reconciliation, there are community hearings, and all of these are equally important mechanisms for upholding accountability. And of course, I believe that groups on the ground who are affected by issues, they need to decide the kind of accountability that's right for them. And with our question around gender persecution, we're really not even at that question of what accountability should look like, because we're still back in the part of the question of what's a harm or a wrongdoing, right? If we can't agree on that, on who is a victim or why they're a victim, then we can't inform the type of accountability mechanism that's chosen later. So sometimes people, I think that I'm, you know, kind of pro traditional tribunals. And I really take a much more complicated approach towards accountability, really think it is a ground up approach. But I do think that we're kind of back in that first stage of, let's first talk about what's a harm. Like, what is a crime? Because if we don't see it, you can't hold it accountable. And it doesn't really matter what your accountability mechanism looks like, because we have to have that conversation first.
We've got time for one more question from the floor. Does anybody have one that they want to ask? Great. And then I'm going to leap into chair's prerogative and ask one of my own to close. So thank you.
Hi. Sorry, I'm not very knowledgeable on this subject at all. In terms of who is a victim and stuff, could you talk a little bit more about the sexuality and gender kind of coming under gender persecution? I thought that was really interesting. I just didn't understand it that much.
Just repeat the question as well, because just to make sure it was picked up on the mic. Oh, that was a brilliant question. Thank you. And I think you're asking for a bit more clarification on sexual orientation and gender identity and how that fits in gender persecution. Is that right?
Well, everyone has sexual orientation and everyone has gender identity, right? Those are usually terms we use when we're talking about LGBTIQ rights. But in reality, everyone has a sexual orientation. So when we think about sexual orientation under the umbrella of gender, it's pretty easy to say that discriminating against someone based on their sexual orientation, whatever that orientation is gender discrimination. And so therefore, it applies to everyone equally. I think when we're looking at the issue of sex and sexuality and sexual violence, we have to start unpacking it in terms of those multiple forms of discrimination too. So when men are raped in conflict, why are they raped? Why are women raped? In getting behind the motives behind that discrimination, I think are really important to kind of uproot different forms of homophobia and misogyny that may also not be visible in the particular crime that we're looking at. So what do I mean by that? I mean is sometimes very commonly you have in conflict, you'll have women who are raped because they're thought of as war prizes. They're war booty, they're chattel, they're the enemy's wife. That's what they're there for. That's their role. That's what they're good for. And that, of course, we can see the discrimination and misogyny that drives that rape. Why are men raped in war? Sometimes men are raped to humiliate them, to make them feel powerless, make them feel like they couldn't be the protectors of their community, to make them feel like they're a woman or a homosexual, because who wants to be that? Now we start to see the misogyny and the homophobia in the complexity of rape in terms of some cases of rape against men. Still gender discrimination, still persecution, still needs to be upheld like any other crime. But if we can start unpacking those narratives of why that rape happened and understanding the discrimination of how sexual violence is used against men, we actually start to also unearth the misogyny and the homophobia that drives that rape as well, just looking at it from a different lens, right? And recognizing that gender minorities, right? Vulnerable people who are vulnerable because of their gender in conflict or in society had that running stream of discrimination that we also need to unearth. And it helps us unearth that, I think.
Yeah, you have a question.
Obviously you have an amazing background with civil society and such a great like feminist approach to your work. How can we develop those skills so that we're able to bring this lens and experience into our roles? Because I don't know if like traditional legal education necessarily provides you with that experience to address these like emerging issues. So do you have any advice for us as young lawyers in training?
As to how to like engage with this work, or
Does your legal provide you with like this experience?
yeah, it really should, right? I mean, we're lucky to have professors like Rose Gray teaching, because through Rose bringing in speakers and teaching it in class, we're able to infuse education. And there's a few of us that are trying to do that in our work in our universities. I think a lot of this also is just work we have to do on our own. But now that you can see it, right? Just see it. It's like always remembering to apply it. And it can apply in conflict. It can apply in a conversation with people. It can apply anywhere. And then getting the word out. If you're going to work in this field, don't forget it. Use it and educate others and spread the word. Because the only way we're really going to uphold these crimes is if we're teaching each other the same skills that we're learning, so that everybody is trying to address it together.
The question I wanted to ask before we close is about cultural relativism, which is sometimes a label used for this practice where when people speak about gender equality or women's empowerment, there is sometimes a pushback from different people all around the world, in the Western world, in other parts of the world, saying it's always been part of our culture to differentiate between men and women, or it's always been part of our culture to put LGBT people at the margins. And so when international organizations like the United Nations or the International Criminal Court come and preach at us about gender equality, that is an assault on our culture, and it's disrespectful to our traditions. This is something that comes up time and time again in different gender-based charges, but I wanted to know, how does your policy deal with this issue that there are currently 123 states parties to the International Criminal Court and rising? They all have different cultures. Some of them are very progressive and have women's empowerment and LGBT empowerment as part of their practices and celebrate this. Some are at the other end of the spectrum, where it is legal as well as social practice to discriminate against women and other marginalised gender groups. So how does your policy respond to this reality of the fact that there is this looming issue of cultural relativism, and whether that's reconcilable with this picture of women's empowerment and LGBT empowerment?
I think that's a great question. We know culture is not an excuse to shirk a state's responsibility to follow international human rights. And what the foundation to persecution, if you look at element 1, it's the violation of a fundamental right. So we're talking about fundamental rights. In fact, we're talking about severe deprivations of fundamental rights. So these are not things that should be taken lightly. Fundamental rights have been mulled over, discussed, agreed upon, a part of customary international law. There's something about them that we feel like universally all humans are entitled to, and the right to be free from discrimination is certainly part of that tenet of rights. So it's not something we take lightly. It's also a problem that every society faces. Gender discrimination is in every society. So sometimes we do this where we particularize it with a particular country or culture, because we can see where there might be discrimination that's different than the way we practice discrimination. And really, it's universal. And I think really all discrimination is universal to a certain extent. So we know that we can't use culture as an excuse. We have to uphold fundamental rights. That's what makes them fundamental. And, and the policy paper really addresses that. It talks about that provision, but it also, I think with gender discrimination, it's just a little bit different than other forms of discrimination because it's just so normalized and it's so ingrained in us where we're almost like uncomfortable to challenge it in other contexts because of culture, where we wouldn't be uncomfortable to challenge other fundamental rights that are violated in culture, like the oppression of minority groups, which happens in every country, everywhere in the world at one point or another. So for as long as I've been working in Iraq, I've heard about discrimination against Yazidis since far before ISIS. It's more closed community, it's different, it's minority, always has suffered discrimination. Some might say that's part of the cultural practice. Do we tolerate that? Absolutely not. Or the treatment of Afro-Colombians in Colombia, or the treatment of Afro-descended or indigenous persons everywhere in the world, right? Do we accept that that's okay and a part of culture? Absolutely not. But we've done some work on ethnic and racial persecution. We know we need to address it. We know it's prevalent and we know it's wrong and we know it's a violation of a fundamental right. We need to do that same work on gender discrimination, both within ourselves and within the world, because our uncomfortability in challenging it comes from our own internalized oppression. So the more we can analogize it to race and ethnic persecution, which I think is good models for us to follow in terms of how to look at it, the more I think we start to realize that, yeah, this is a deprivation of a fundamental right, and it's wrong, and that's not what we have agreed as good practice as an international community.
Thank you. I wanted to thank you all for being here because it's just brilliant to have all these people in the room engaging on this issue. And thank you particularly for showing patience when we had some traffic difficulties. Lisa, I wanted to thank you for coming here. You're a very busy person. You're a professor at the City University of New York. You are working on the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty. You're the ICC Prosecutor's Special Advisor on Gender Crimes. And you're here for so many different engagements. So I'm thrilled that you could come and join us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.